Well, good morning. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Grant Bergen, and I'm a member of the board of Health Coalition Aotearoa. So firstly, I'd like to warmly welcome you all to this webinar, but in particular, I'd like to welcome our speakers this morning, Professor Gary Murphy from Ireland. Welcome, Gary. Max Rashbrook, writer and public intellectual. Good to see you again, Max. Associate Professor Yi Fuing from Australia, Nau Mai Haere Mai Yi, and Julie Hagee from Transparency International in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Welcome, Julie. People, this is the first in a series of 4 webinars that Health Coalition Aotearoa are holding in the coming months as part of our Investing in Prevention series for this election year. This particular webinar focuses on lobbying, transparency, and the influence of vested interests on public decision making. So before I hand over to our moderator for this session, Chris Finlayson, let me open us with a karakia. Tukua te wairua kia rere ki ngā taumata hei arahi i a tātou mahi, me tā tātou whai ngā tikanga rātou mā, kia mau, kia ita, kia kore ai e ngaro, kia pupuri, kia whakamaua, kia tīna, tīna, haumi e hui e, tae ki e. So I'm sure most of you will know Chris Finlayson, who is the former Attorney General of our country and a highly respected constitutional lawyer with long experience in public law, politics, and the workings of Parliament. Chris, we are very pleased to have you, and over to you. Kia ora.
Well, thank you very much, Grant. Rau rangatira mā tēnei taku mihi atu kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, which for our guests from overseas is a traditional greeting acknowledging all the great and respected leaders here today. I acknowledge you, I acknowledge you, I acknowledge you. It is a hugely important topic that we're going to be discussing, ways in which we can ensure that our precious liberal democracy remains liberal and is a democracy, and what are the checks and balances that we need to have to ensure that we have a safe and robust democracy. So what I would like to do is to ask our very special guests some questions and then open up the webinar for people to ask their own questions. Time is reasonably short, so I suggest we rock on immediately with this opening question, and I would invite all panelists to answer. New Zealand currently has extremely limited regulation of lobbying compared with other democracies. From the perspective of the panelists, what risks does that create for public trust and policy making? Gary, welcome from Ireland. I'd invite you to make a start.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Of course, it's a Monday night here in Ireland, so it's a completely different day. The regulation of lobbying, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and writing about it. I've written 2 books with that title, Regulating Lobbying: A Global Comparison. So I know a lot about, or I think I do at least, lobbying regulations across the globe, of which you say New Zealand isn't exactly a stellar performer, but Ireland wasn't either. Ireland had no lobbying regulations whatsoever until 2015, and I can go into them later on. But if you want an open government, if you want if you want an architecture of open government, and we know open government is better government than closed government because citizens know what's happening in their name, well, there are a few structures of that architecture you need. You need freedom of information, for the most part. You need some sort of whistleblower legislation, and you need a regulation of lobbying so that people can understand and know who is lobbying who about what. And that might sound very simple, but it's the essential, in my view, of how lobbying regulation should work. People should understand and know who is lobbying their government, whether it's politicians, civil servants, public officials, and what they are lobbying them about, and crucially, if they are being paid. And that's a huge issue across the globe. But there is a central question about the regulation of lobbying, and I don't think there's anything wrong with lobbying. I think for the most part, lobbying is can be very useful if it's done openly and overtly and in the public good. But secret lobbying, covert lobbying, does no one any favors. It hurts a country's international reputation, and ultimately it hurts a country's citizens. So we've had 10 years of lobbying here, and I can talk about that in detail later on. But I would say that regulating lobbying has proved quite a significant success here in Ireland, and we see it now as part of our architecture of clean and open government.
Thank you for that, Gary. From Perth, I'm going to invite Yifui to respond. And thank you very much for getting up so early to take part in this seminar.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, it's 5 a.m. here, and I'm not a morning person, so this is something. So yeah, thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. And so lobbying, on the one hand, is a form of political participation. So it is a form of communication that and seeking to influence government may be a legitimate activity and have an important role to play in the democratic process. But on the other hand, democracies can also be undermined by lobbying because lobbying can give special advantages to vested interests, with negotiations being carried on behind closed doors, as Gary said, the secrecy of lobbying. And that might override the public interest in the government decision making. And in Victoria, in Australia, in Melbourne, where I normally live, in 2023, the independent broad-based anti-corruption commissions Operation Send-On, it was revealed that lobbyists had funneled briefcases of cash worth more than $100,000 from a property developer to two councillors under the guise of sham transactions. And as a result of all these kinds of scandals, anti-corruption commissions in Australia have been very, very busy, uncovering various corruption scandals, and some of them have involved lobbyists. In New South Wales, a former politician had lobbied various New South Wales politicians and basically ended up in jail because he had corruptly secured some benefit for himself and his family in terms of land deals. And it's not just Australia. In the United States, basically there was notorious lobbyist called Jack Abramoff, who lobbied on behalf of Native American tribes seeking to establish gambling on reservations, and he grossly overcharged his clients, and in one case secretly orchestrated lobbyists against his own clients, and to force them to pay for his lobbying services. And as a result, Abramoff was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment after pleading guilty to mail fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to bribe public officials. In Europe, there was the cash for amendment scandal, where it was revealed that four members of the European Parliament were videotaped agreeing to accept bribes in exchange for official favors from journalists who were masquerading as lobbyists. So together, all these explosive scandals show that the regulation of political lobbying is a global corruption challenge for governments.
Thank you very much for that. Gary, tell us about the New Zealand experience. I'm sorry, but Gary, you hardly expected to. Max, I mean.
Skills are many, Chris, but they don't go that far.
I was just thinking, Gary, it's ironic that you're a day behind us because I think in all respects Ireland is ahead of us when it comes to lobbying regulation. Um, yeah, look, as you said at the outset, Chris, we have essentially no regulation of lobbying in New Zealand. The instruments that are pretty standard in a lot of other developed countries, so a register of who's lobbying whom, stand down periods for cabinet ministers, and that's before they become lobbyists, those kinds of things we simply don't have. And I think the risks that creates, well, not to retread what Gary and you have already said, I would just position that in a world where we have increasing economic disparities, increasing gaps between rich and poor in New Zealand as elsewhere. And I think that's a lot of what is driving the turn towards authoritarian populism that we see all around the world, which is driven by this huge suspicion of elites and the view that the political contest is to some extent rigged. And while those fears can be exaggerated, it is certainly very possible for wealth to be converted into political power, for people to have unequal access, unequal influence. And if you think about the mechanisms through which that can happen, one of them is donations to political parties. That's a separate but important issue. And another one, of course, is lobbying. As Gary said, lobbying is a natural and healthy part of a democracy, but one of the great issues that can arise is if there's an imbalance in terms of who's able to fund the lobbying activities. And just as a last point, in New Zealand, I think there are growing concerns about the state of our economy and the fact we have very limited competition in a lot of key areas like groceries and energy production, fuel retailing, building supplies, insurance, banking. Um, and I think there's a plausible argument that those, they're very powerful, small number of players who extract excess profits from those industries maintain their position partly through lobbying, partly through distorting public processes, through limiting the regulation that they face, through limiting efforts to introduce greater competition in those areas. So I think the failure to regulate lobbying ties right into some of those big concerns people have about whether people have equal influence and access.
Thank you very much, Max. Julie, you've been very involved in Transparency International for some years, and this is a major topic for TA. Would you like to make a contribution now?
Yes, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this. And Gary, it's a problem. It's an absolute problem, and I was going to talk about this answer on the element of public trust. So, when citizens perceive there is an imbalance in influence on power, they lose trust in Parliament and public institutions to protect them. So they'll then look to people who appear to challenge that. And populist leaders feed and exploit that sentiment. They use divisions between the people and corrupt elites. They represent themselves as being the only ones holding out against the wave of others. So and it's ironic because governance by populist leadership frequently involves limiting of transparency and rejection of accountability mechanisms. But distrust also results in people withdrawing from the public policy-making process, or even from the discourse, and being more attracted to hardened views. And we see breakdowns in social cohesion, attacks on particular groups, and that's fueled by a lack of regulation around the harm generated by things like social media platforms. And all of this is dangerous because public institutions can't be effective when people doubt their motivations and start to disengage from them. And we see people removing themselves from things like public health, or having less involvement in things like public health, less involvement in the social contract elements like census and voting. And also compromise and collaboration, which are at the heart of our decision-making process, are attacked as further evidence of incompetence or corruption. And that's the problem. It gets turned in on itself. And so we think there's absolute need for lobbying regulation in New Zealand as one of those core elements, as has been said, of transparency and of behaviour, which I'll talk about in a while. And it means what we need from New Zealand. New Zealanders have got reducing trust in the establishments in Parliament and in public services, and we must reverse that in order to actually be able to uphold things like the rule of law and due process. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think, Gary, the international perspective and the Irish perspective would seem to be a very valuable one for us. You mentioned the change in 2015 in Ireland. Could you perhaps tell us what prompted the reform and what particular problems was the legislation trying to solve?
Yeah, Chris, there are two things. One, Ireland went through a series of corruption scandals. So like Ifu said, in the 1990s, we went through a series of basic revelations uncovered by journalists that lobbyists in the issuing of licenses and in the issue of zoning of land, which huge monies can be made of, were basically bribing politicians. Now, the standard view here of the lobbyists was that they were giving monies to promote public discourse, and it was sort of payment for no political response. But those who were getting the payments mysteriously kept voting for those who pay them the money, the lobbyists. And these scandals brought a series of tribunals of inquiry. The trouble with the tribunal of inquiry was they lasted for 14 years. We had two tribunals beginning in 1997. They did not complete until 2011. And of course, in the middle of the, not in the middle, but towards the end of that period, Ireland lost its sovereignty, which is a very important point. We lost our economic sovereignty in 2010 when the Irish state had to bring in the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the EU to give us this 85 billion euro loan because we could not borrow on the bond markets anymore. There was a general election in February 2011. The result was the collapse of the dominant Fianna Fáil party, which had been in power for something like 64 of the previous 80 odd years. Was the natural party of government and the one most closely associated with those scandals. And in 2011, it reduces from 76 seats to 20 seats in a parliament of about 160. So a complete wipeout. But the important point is at that election, many people, to go back to Julie's point, had sort of lost interest or perhaps lost hope. And the idea of new politics was an important part of that election. And the opposition parties who then formed the coalition, Fine Gael and Labour, one of their solutions or proposals, and I had been in touch with all political parties at the time, was to have this regulation of lobbying, to have a register of lobbyists and a register of interests. And then if this would transpire, we would then know who was lobbying whom about what, to use that phrase. I keep using it, but I think it's a very useful phrase because it sums up everything we need to know. And I was told by many people, and this went into the 2011 programme for government, that it wouldn't happen. Ireland was too small. Everybody knew everybody else. But no, everybody doesn't know everybody else. And elites know other elites. And ordinary citizens found themselves disenfranchised. And to be fair to the then government, I suppose you would have what the political science literature might say a policy or a political entrepreneur. We had a minister who I spoke to at some length at the time who said that he thought this was a good idea and he pushed it. And basically, in 2015, after much drafting by the Office of the Draftsman, the legislator for Ireland, we got this this act, and it has proved in one way to be an extraordinary success. It's not perfect, and I can go into some of the issues around it. But what it does for the most part is it allows people to search a database where those who are doing the lobbying have to basically register, and those who are lobbied have to register that they have been lobbied by those who are lobbying them. So it might be, to go up to Max's point, it could be something to do with grocery prices or the issuing of licenses or whatever. But any public policy matter is now a matter of public record. Does some covert lobbying still go on? Probably. And it's not that in one way it mightn't be malevolent, it might just be some sort of ignorance, but I think most of that has been sort of gone through the system, and what it has done. I mean, I don't think, for instance, citizens are going through it every day wondering who the hell is lobbying anybody else. But what it does is it gives, I think, reassurance that for the most part our politics, after being, to be frank, dirty for quite a number of years, leading to this huge national crisis when the economic sovereignty was lost, that it has been regained, and our politics is a good bit cleaner in the meantime.
Well, that's tremendous. Can you just tell me very briefly, and you sort of adverted to it earlier, what are the key challenges that remain that New Zealand could perhaps take into account as it tries to address this issue?
Well, one of the key challenges is to have a strong definition of what lobbying is and perhaps
Hmm.
is not. We had a controversial incident here in, I think, 2017 when a minister in the government, it became clear that he had dinner with a lobbyist, a person who was in for a very large state contract. This was not declared by either party. It was revealed by a journalist, and the minister said he didn't think it had to be declared because it was simply a private meeting between two individuals. The point being, of course, is that the minister is not a private individual. He is an MP, he is a man who has significant power in the Irish context because he would ultimately sign off on the giving of the license. And one of the huge tribunals of inquiry here was about the granting of a mobile phone license, where the tribunal eventually found corrupt payments had been made, and this was then rejected by the person who actually made the payments. So some people think that maybe haven't taken it too seriously or seriously enough, and I think that's an issue. Also, ambition is important, but I think there must be realism that in the first couple of years of introducing regulation, there will be teething problems, unquestionably. And I think that has to be addressed. And so, for instance, when we were sort of advising the government, we advocated for quite a long gardening leave clause, basically the idea that you wouldn't then go and work for a lobbying firm. I think Max alluded to it earlier. And we were told that that simply wouldn't wash with anybody unless it was a year at most. And there is a dispensation which is used probably more than I think is appropriate. So I think ambition and maybe scaling that ambition is important as well, Chris. Yeah.
No, that's great. So, key points, seminar attenders, decent definition of lobbying, and that's easier said than done,
Mm.
and the transitional arrangements. Thank you very much. There are 2 points to bear in mind. Yi Fumi, you have immense knowledge about comparative governance. How do different democracies regulate lobbying and political influence? And in your opinion, what models appear to work best?
Yeah, good question, Chris. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't follow Australia because our regulation of lobbying is poor, and I've been advocating for change for years, and hasn't happened yet. But what when I looked at overseas models that are more ideal, the United States and Canada have had long-standing lobbying regimes for more than 50 years. And what is noticeable about the better models is the level of disclosure that they have. So they have a lobbyist register that covers all the whole spectrum of lobbyists. As you said, we need to define lobbyists quite broadly. In Australia, we just define it as third-party lobbyists,
Mhm,
whereas that's
mhm.
only 20% of the lobbyist population. That's in-house lobbyists and all sorts of other lobbyists. So it's good to have broad disclosures in terms of the lobbyist register, but also each and every lobbying contact should be disclosed. So lobbyists, lobbyist register should also show each contact that the lobbyist has made for with each minister, member of parliament, and so forth. When you look at the United States, there are even broader disclosures than that. So political donations by lobbyists are also disclosed, and that goes to the idea that money can influence political decisions. And in Queensland, where there is disclosures of the lobbyist contact, they mapped it against political donations, and you can see that the donations go up very close to the election. And that might show that, the lobbyists are trying to use money to influence government decision making. And yes, so that yeah, tying up the data would be quite good in an ideal world. I'm not sure we've got there yet in terms of, the lobbyist contacts, the political donations, and any gifts that lobbyists give. And so all those details being integrated into one spot. And of course, enforcement by an independent regulator is important. So in Canada, there's a Commissioner of Lobbying that regulates the regime and punishes any breaches. If we have a regulator that sits within a government department or agency that's less independent, that is not as useful. We've had that in several jurisdictions in Australia. So an independent regulator that is policing the scheme and keen to enforce, I think, is also key.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Max, you've written extensively on this topic over the years, and you wrote a report, A Balance of Voices, which looked at various options for regulating lobbying in New Zealand. And I'm very interested in the points that Gary and Yifui have just made about, things like the importance of a definition of lobbying, because I could see all sorts of tricks being played to avoid it and so on. What are the key gaps in the current system in New Zealand? And sort of just saying that we have nothing is really a start, but to elaborate on that would be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I guess the crucial place to start is this definition question. I completely agree with you because it's a source of a lot of controversy. And if you get it wrong, then you can, I think, sink your chances of getting effective lobbying regulation across the line. I'd go back to what Gary said. The intuition here is not that lobbying is innately evil. People contacting government and seeking to influence government is perfectly good and natural. But we need to know who is meeting whom. And then the question sort of, I think, then is, well, which part of that picture exactly do we need to know about? And my view about the international regimes that regulate lobbying is that they are trying to hone in on the lobbying that you could informally say is well-resourced, professionalized, high volume, high intensity, the big stuff. And so I was, again, very influenced by Ireland's approach. And they say, look, you're a lobbyist who's going to be the subject of regulation if you are approaching government and you're trying to influence government decision making, and you are one of a few categories. You are working for a firm that's got at least 10 employees. So just, trying to get the bigger end of town there. You work for a trade association, trade union, a body like that, or an NGO that's got at least one paid staff member. So again, trying to cut out the rats and mice, the very small outfits, or you're a third-party lobbyist working on behalf of one of those organizations. And so there's various carve-outs, so if you've got sort of confidential issues to discuss with your constituency MP, it's constituency business, that's not covered. But basically, if you've got some scale, if you've got some resource behind you and you're trying to influence government, then you should be registering your contacts with government. You should be the subject of regulation. So I think if you get that definition right at the outset, I think that's crucial. And then what I recommended was really just that we start with the three instruments that are pretty standard around the world. So the Register of Lobbyists, so every 3 months, let's say, anyone who's doing that lobbying has to upload their contacts to an online portal that everyone can see. So they say, here's who I met, here's the ministers, the public servants, here's what we discussed, here's the nature of the meeting. That's your Register of Lobbying, that's crucial. Second one is a code of conduct for lobbyists, which I think is important, although countries around the world have struggled to give those codes of conduct teeth. But I think you could with proper enforcement, so make sure the lobbying is not being done unethically. And then thirdly, the stand down or the cooling off period to deal with the revolving door. So let's say if you're a minister or perhaps an MP or a senior public servant, after you leave your job, there has to be a period of a year, let's say, or it could be 3 years, where you can't go back and lobby government and misuse that confidential information that you gained in your position. So I think just starting with those three key forms, the register, the code of conduct, and the stand down period, would make a huge difference here.
Can I just ask one quick question? I'm a litigation lawyer. I sue people or act for people who are sued. But if from time to time I write to the government to set out a position to resolve litigation, and I don't write to Crown Law, but I write to a particular minister, then I should be careful because I could be, in that instance, actually be lobbying a lobbyist on behalf of a company.
Yes, and that's certainly a complexity that I've had to explore with lawyers in New Zealand. I mean, my impression is that all international regimes find a way of differentiating sort of legal client privilege issues from when lawyers are just doing lobbying. But sorry, Gary, you're probably better placed to speak to that than I am.
No, I was just about to say, Max, that your second point is, I think, how we do it here in Ireland. If you're a lawyer hired by a client, and that client wants to influence government, and you're then contacting government on behalf of that client in an
Mhm.
explicit lobbying way, as a thing from, I think, what your example, Chris, then that would fall under the legislation
Uh,
here,
uh,
because it would clearly be, I mean, so we did grapple with this whole lawyer-client confidentiality issue, and the lawyers, of
mm,
course, were up in arms about it on that privilege issue. But I think
mm.
it is now pretty much well respected and guaranteed that if you're lobbying on behalf of a client, that as a lawyer, that should be registered. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. I'm just trying to tease out your all-important definition question.
No,
It's just
it's
really,
a very important point. I would just add one other thing to Max's point, which is charities. Some charities are very concerned about lobbying regulation when it comes in the first place, that they will be somewhat overburdened because they spend their whole day trying to
okay,
lobby
sure.
governments in relation
Yep.
to getting more funds for whatever charity they represent. And that is something that, again, we grappled with, and that has to be clearly thought about. And it goes to the idea of having a pretty simple portal, and that it's not so onerous that you're doing it every month. So I think 3 times a
Yeah.
year is reasonable. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Julie, some cynics listening in on this webinar may say, well, everyone's deliciously naive, but can you tell us why, in practical terms, lobbying regulation actually does matter for public trust in democratic institutions?
Yeah. First, I'll just pick up on that the discussion around definition, because Transparency International has signed off on a code of ethical advocacy, and Transparency International New Zealand has also and put it in place from last year, and I had to prepare our first public disclosure of the organisations that we've been trying to lobby and influence, and both scope and definition are certainly taxing us in terms of what we include, what we would call information, what we would call advocacy, but it's still really important, because what it does is it inspires the ethical discussions. And I think that's as valuable as anything for us. So yes, about why it's so important. Well, really, it is about making it publicly visible. Who's talking to who about what is a great core phrase. And you look at that. I mean, we have some elements that are really visible, like the ministerial diaries, and look at that excellent research from Carolyn Shaw and others about what they could tell from the minister diaries about who's talking to them. That was very recently published, and that is exactly what you need. We need to be able to have the information visible so that people can actually see and then to call it out and have people needing to justify their positions. So I think that's all part of developing integrity, which is, I mean, we don't all come with integrity inbuilt as much as we think we do, especially when we want to achieve results or we're competing with others. And so that's where integrity slides, just because of the pressures. And so that is what this lobbying regulation should do. It is improve our practice and improve our ethical understanding I would include charities. I think we just have to suck it up. It's part of being of integrity processes and charities. But yeah, I think that's just important for enhancing transparency and integrity at the highest levels.
Can I ask each of you to give just one example of how lobbying shapes a policy environment which may well affect the lives of every New Zealander, not only, well, especially in terms of health incomes, but in ways that the public may not necessarily see?
You want me to start?
Julie, do you want to have a go? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, that research from Karen Shaw about the ministerial diaries really did show up how there's a shaping of a policy environment. I mean, I've heard politicians say that he wants to hold more power, that it's his responsibility to do so, and being elected having means power both over policy and the administration of that policy. So those views are held at Parliament right now, and by parties as well. And people want somebody to be a strong man and take control, that kind of thing as well, as a problem. But it's when the narrative about holding power then assumes a dominance over other democratic norms. That's like public participation and judicial challenge and legislative making, a separation of powers. And into that space step those who want to frame up the public decision making and the public dialogue. So that's when executive power is very heavily influenced by industry. I think others can point to specific industries, but I think it's that principle around making sure that we are enabling public participation, good due process in the legislative process. That's the problem that I see as a real issue here for at Parliament.
Max, any particular example from a New Zealand perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a number that you could adduce. Kirsty Johnson at RNZ, I think it was the year before last, did a big series, I think it was called Cow versus Crown, about the lobbying of federated farmers and the like, and just the extraordinary volume of access they got, sort of privileged access, meeting with ministers when others weren't, and which has been very influential over a long period of time in ensuring that farmers don't even begin to pay for their carbon emissions. Another one would be the fast food industry, who've lobbied very successfully over a long period of time to water down New Zealand's health labelling policies, which means that it's much harder in New Zealand to discover, is this food that I'm looking to buy in the supermarket actually extremely unhealthy? That regulation has been watered down time and again, to the extent we're quite out of step with the rest of the world. And I think those lobbying campaigns are successful because of the imbalance in access. I'm carrying out a project at the moment interviewing current and former MPs and public servants about what it's like to be lobbied and what are the tactics used and why they're successful. And the picture that people paint for me are ministers are very time poor. If someone turns up with what looks like an incredibly easy and elegant solution, it's very tempting to take that. As you'll know, Chris, MPs spend a huge amount of time in the parliamentary precinct. It's very hard to leave often. So the alcohol companies will put on these very lavish events in Parliament, wine and dine people, build those bonds of camaraderie and sort of friendship. And take advantage of those big boozy evenings to just sort of tap someone on the shoulder and say, "Oh, it'd be really good to talk about this," or "I've got a client who's got an interest in such and such," and that's just a level of access that the rest of us can't attain.
You'll be pleased to know I never attended any of those. Gary, you talked a lot about land development, and I think in various jurisdictions, land development, lobbying, and paying people off seems to be par for the course. I think of Spiro Agnew in Baltimore when he was chief executive of Baltimore, and he was still receiving envelopes of money when he was vice president to Richard Nixon. So land development, big deal. What other areas can you think of?
He had to resign eventually, though, Chris. Spyro Agnew. Is it Spiro or Spyro? Yeah, I think the point Max makes about the influence of the farming lobby is an important one, and it's a big issue here in Ireland with various derogations from carbon targets. Now, the farmers are only too happy to show their members what lobbying they have done, and this is one of the kind of the nuanced points. Lots of people who lobby for very special interests are only too happy then to go back to their members and say we're successful, even though it might be not against, but there might be significant majorities against what they've actually done. So if you take that climate change lobby against the farming lobby, I think that might be an example there. But back to zoning, I mean, anywhere where the government is issuing a license, whether this could be in things like mining rights or house development or anything like that. I mean, I think that it's just essentially got to be in the public domain, because basically these things can be licenses to print money. If you're a developer who is, there's a huge housing problem here in Ireland, but at least now we know if the housing companies are lobbying government for licenses. We know that, and I think that really is really the heart of the issue here that we're trying to get at. If you have an open polity, I think it's just better for the public.
And of course, we've spent a lot of time talking about central government this morning, but it also applies obviously to
Local
local
level,
government
yeah.
and the areas you've been talking about. Absolutely critical to have um, a regime which will cover lobbying local government.
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, it's like lobbying is just cannot be essential just at the national
No,
parliamentary level. You have to dig down anywhere again where and in Ireland there's a long history of local. Ireland has pretty weak central government, but the one place that has strong powers is in the delivery of housing. And in that context, the fact that you know who the lobbyists are is, I think, really important. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. Yi Fui, can you think of a fresh example other than what your panelists have talked about?
Maybe not so fresh now that I'm gone last, but in Australia we have had a lot of an oversized influence in the by the fossil fuel and mining industries in climate policy. So Australia lags way behind in terms of progressive climate policy. And this is I was a public servant in the Prime Minister's department, and there was a big tax review that went on, and it very sensibly proposed a mining rent resources tax on the oversized profit that miners get. And that was the government agreed to implement that, and immediately there was a huge counter response by the fossil fuel industry, front pages, ads everywhere. And the government backed down very quickly. And I was quite surprised that yeah, sensible government policy was immediately stymied. But this has happened for many years in Australia, where the fossil fuel industry, the miners, and some conservative politicians have blocked climate policy for decades. And they even call themselves the greenhouse mafia. And at one point, the Prime Minister of Australia was brandishing a pile of coal in Parliament, going, "Oh, look, this is coal, don't be afraid of it." And who gave him that lump of coal? It was a lobbyist. So, and this has continued as well in the most recent Australian election, that in 2025, it Senate inquiry basically looked at climate disinformation and the ADMS, the automated decision making in society, and I contributed to their submission. We did a study that showed that there were all these groups that were pretending to be grassroots organizations, but they were actually funded by lobbyists or well-funded interests, like Mums for Nuclear. Like we know mums really care about nuclear. So that there was the debate about nuclear energy, the about whether that should be introduced in Australia as part of the election. So there was a lot of astroturfing, like all these well-funded groups pretending to be grassroots, and also the lobbyist industry itself. I mean, the fossil fuel industry itself has spent considerable amount of donations to politicians. They're one of the biggest political donors. So because of all this advocacy and lobbying, we've seen a really stagnated climate policy in Australia, and that has been decades of this.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give you a right of reply in a minute, but there's been a question that's been asked that I think is the crunch question, and I think it would be valuable for panelists if we spent a minute or two on it. And it's from Tex Edwards saying, look, yep, the need for regulation is there for all to see, but how do we get it across the line when there have been just so many failed attempts? And so how do you persuade politicians to change the pattern of many, many years and introduce legislation like this? Gary, sorry to pick on you always as the first panelist, but that question was doubtless asked in Ireland in 2015.
It was, and you need a champion. No more complicated than that, Chris. It needs a champion. The champion in Ireland was a man called Brendan Howlin. He had been long experience in both government and opposition. He took quite seriously the fact that Ireland's international reputation had been tarnished by these various scandals, and also by the fact that the country had lost its sovereignty, and was persuaded that a register of lobbyists would be a good thing in trying to persuade people, look, that there is nothing underhand in how government does its business. In one way, this is trying to move beyond elites interfering with the public policy process. This is about uh, this is about normal people being able to see what's being done in their particular name. But if you do not have a champion who can go to the his own or her own parliamentary party and persuade other people that this would be a good thing internationally for the country, but also for the party who might actually bring this in. And there are plenty of examples. I mean, I've been going on about Ireland, but you've made up some very good. The Canadian example is good. I mean, in America, a lot of these state legislations have been watered down by the Republicans in particular. And so I think that example sometimes is not as no strong as it certainly was maybe 2 decades ago. But there are examples internationally of regulations and lobbying working. Some of the Eastern European states have brought in the regulation of lobbying, Scandinavian states, some of the Western European states. And if you can point to international examples, good. And there are international examples, but it needs a champion. It's no more complicated than that. And you need somebody who will take the knocks and bounce
Thank
back.
you very much. Yi Fui, the Australian experience. How do you get change in Australia?
Yeah, I've looked at the evolution of lobbying regulation across the Australian jurisdiction. So we've got the federal level, 6 states and 2 territories. And you generally see tighter regulation every time there's a scandal. So if an explosive scandal occurs and, politicians go to jail because they got, influenced by lobbyists, or lobbyists go to jail, briefcases of cash. There was one with I think a few 100,000 in an LD plastic bag. So we've got modern ways of bribing our politicians now. It's LD plastic bags and briefcases, not just the brown paper bags. So every time you see a scandal occurring, that's sort of an impetus for introducing tougher regulation, because people can see what the issue is. Like, oh, right, this influence has led to corruption. So it's then that we normally see tighter regulation. And yeah, otherwise it's quite difficult because it's not in the politicians' interest to regulate themselves. And the lobbyists will counter lobby as well, saying, no, we don't need regulation, nothing to see here. So without the scandal, and as Gary said, without a champion in government, it's quite difficult to achieve change. And that's why we see like change not really happening in various jurisdictions.
Julie.
Well, just repeating it, you've got to have a champion.
Yeah.
You've got to have a champion in a party. We've also got external influence. The UNCAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption Executive Summary is just out, and it recommends New Zealand put in place lobbying regulation. So that's an external pressure, but it's up to the parties to see what. It's not just lobbying that needs to have more integrity in Parliament. It's a range of things, and an integrity framework and a whole set. But this is core to that of having a lobbying regulation in New Zealand. I think it's up to civil society also to put pressure on, and it's what we're trying to do. I think, but I think you need those leaders in government, and you need the leaders in industry. I'm surprised that there's been nobody in the lobbying industry saying, we should be professional like other industries. We should be held accountable. We should have ethical practices. That's what we also need.
And
Can I just come in there, Chris?
Yeah, Gary, please do.
Well, no, I mean, we grappled with that here in Ireland about lobbying companies who exactly had the same view that this was a ridiculous idea, there was no need for them. But funnily enough, most of them have changed their view and their mind and are happy to be associated with the regulation because they can show their clients that their lobbying has been successful. And they can say, we lobbied the Minister for health, and we wanted a new private hospital built, and now it's built. That is the type of thing that lobbyists actually like. And so it shouldn't be beyond the bounds of possibility and persuasion that to get the lobbying industry, which is very large globally, on board. And most lobbying firms, certainly here in Ireland, now it's a small community, granted, are happy to show their wares as being successful.
Max, can I ask you a question which has come up, and it's actually a very important one. How's lobbying differentiated from networking, or in the New Zealand context, whanaungatanga? So I go along to Shane Jones' party before Waitangi Day, which is our national day, Gary and Yifui, and have a good chat and get to know people. That's not lobbying, Mr. Finlayson, that's networking.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, and there was another similar one in the chat saying, "What's the difference between lobbying and advocacy?" I think. I think the reality is, if you are contacting decision makers, and I would define that again like the Irish do, so ministers, MPs, and the top three tiers of the public service, and you are discussing public policy matters, then that is lobbying, and that's not a bad thing. To reiterate, I think charities sometimes are wary about the idea that they should have to register their lobbying because they think lobbying is a bad thing and they're being tarnished with the same brush as multinational corporations. But it's not. Just the principle is, as Gary keeps saying, we need to see who is lobbying whom. So there isn't really, if you're contacting decision makers hoping to get things changed, that is lobbying. You can call it advocacy if you want, but it's lobbying, and it should be on a register alongside all the other lobbying. I mean, there's a world of stuff, engaging with the media, running big campaigns out in public, talking to journalists, talking directly to the public. That's not captured by this kind of lobbying regulation. But I just think we need to get away from the idea that lobbying is bad and that charities are sort of doing something that's pure and better and shouldn't be caught up in this terrible tarnished lobbying stuff. It's not. We just need to see who is contacting whom, who's trying to influence government.
Julie, any comments on that?
I absolutely agree. It's about improving practice generally. I absolutely agree. I think nothing more to say about that one.
Well, I think many of the questions that have been asked have, in fact, in the course of the seminar, been answered. So I want to just give a minute just a minute to our panelists to respond before I wrap things up. So perhaps if we start with Yifui.
I might add quickly to the previous comments that you can introduce a threshold of significance as to the lobbyists in terms of a certain proportion of time they spend lobbying, a certain amount of money they spend lobbying, and that might capture the major players we want to capture, but not capture mums and dads approaching their local MP. So introducing a threshold of significance will, I think, remove some of those concerns that people have. And just to sum up, I think regulating lobbying is really important for our democracy. We've seen various instances where lobbyists and lobbying government officials has led to corruption in various jurisdictions. So it is important to seize the gauntlet and basically for governments to show transparency about what they're doing. And yeah, it's high time we do that in this current global context.
Thank you very much. Max.
Yes. Look, thanks, Chris. There was a question in the chat about what is the proof that lobbying regulation works. And I would point to the American example where there's pretty good evidence that states in America that have introduced tough lobbying regulation don't see such a close connection between what their wealthy constituents want and the decisions that actually get made. And legislators also feel that they are better insulated from vested interest lobbying. So I think lobbying regulation can, to some extent, break or weaken the connection, wealth being converted into power. And something that stems from that, and to add to the discussion about, how do you get the stuff over the line? I think sometimes we talk about lobbying regulation in slightly ethereal terms, and we say, well, it's all about protecting the public interest. And for a lot of people, the public interest is a pretty vague concept. I wonder if we need to talk more about lobbying regulation in the sense that you are going to lose out. If you have a company that's very deserving, you may lose out because someone else, a less deserving company, has paid lobbyists and has got the settlement that they want. Or you may be paying more at the pump, you may be paying more for groceries, because these big uncompetitive firms are able to hire lobbyists. I think we need to make the harms to people much more evident.
Thank you very much. Julie.
I think that what people want to see is changes in ethical behaviours by individuals, organisations, lobbyists, parliamentarians. We want to see an additional ethical lens over what they're doing, and that they appreciate why this is important, and that therefore that becomes part of the culture of public decision making at Parliament, and people understand that that's what it's all about because they can see it happening. And I think that's the real element when people will renew their trust in government and consider, and when they're able to be called to account, when they can see what's happening. I think it's all about transparency, and it's all about transparency and integrity. It's at the very heart of this.
And finally, Gary, I must say, I've kept thinking about your questions about definitions and so on. There are some really, from a lawyer's perspective, interesting definitional issues, but greatly valued your and Yi Fui's contribution. But a last word to you, please.
Thanks very much, Chris, and again, thanks for the invitation. I've learned an awful lot myself over the course of the last hour or so. Just back to Yi Fui's point, there's a big debate here in Ireland, or there was about a decade ago, about would this stop local people going to see their local politician, their TD as we call him here, elected member of Parliament. And a lot of people put forward this as a reason why you wouldn't have a lobbying regulation. And of course, that makes no sense, because no one is stopping their individual, an individual going to see their local MP, looking for access to a medical card or health services or whatever. What we're talking about here, and why I think New Zealand should really grasp the nettle, is about reputation for open government. Lobbying regulation is a central part of open government, and open government is clearly better government for everybody, for all citizens, but also should be the case for those who lobby and those who are lobbied. And if you don't have it, as simple as that, well, you are simply lagging behind most other states in the world which have some sort of lobbying regulation, because they realise that ultimate question that we need to know who is influencing public policy is an important one for all citizens, whether they're interested in politics or not. So I think I probably said enough. So there you have it.
No, it's been
We'll hear from
fabulous.
Ireland
And
anyway.
Max and Julie, I've got some ideas about ways and means, but I'll talk to you about that at some stage. Could I ask Grant to close the hui and thank you very much to our overseas contributors. It's just been fantastic.
Yes, kia ora. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And on behalf of Health Coalition Aotearoa and those who have joined us this morning on our webinar, I want to express our warm thanks to you all, Gary in Ireland, Max, Yi in Australia, Julie, and of course to your good self, Chris, for moderating our session this morning. Thanks for giving up your time, knowledge and experience to contribute to our webinar and this important topic. And I'll close this with karakia. Hikitia te rongo mai whiti o tēnei kaupapa, tukua kia ea, tukua kia oi, ko rangi nui ki runga ko papa tuanuki ki raro, tu turu whakamawa kia tīna, tīna. Haumi e hui e, tāe ki e. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.